At the reading of the will, my daughter inherited our house and $6 million. I was left with a creaking cabin and the taste of copper in my mouth. The air in Mr. Kaplan's office smelled like lemon polish and old paper, the kind that sticks to your fingers when you're trying not to shake. Emily's diamond caught the afternoon sun as she pressed her lips together, pretending surprise while her eyes flicked to me, calculating, guilty, or maybe just relieved. The wall clock ticked too loudly, the HVAC hummed, and Mr. Kaplan didn't meet my gaze as he slid the documents across his oak desk. I heard the word cabin as if it were a verdict, not a legacy. My name, Margaret Walker, felt small and far away in that room where my husband's voice lived only on the page. $6 million wired to a trust before the week was out. The Colonial on Maple Street deeded to Emily by sunset, and me holding a thin envelope with keys that smelled faintly of cedar and mice. I could see the house in my mind, the blue shutters I painted by hand, the magnolia tree Robert and I planted the spring Emily graduated, the piano where I learned to play Autumn Leaves. It was all hers now, signed and sealed, while my future crackled like the peeling varnish on the cabin's porch swing 2 states away. Emily wiped at tears that didn't fall. Mr. Kaplan pushed a box of tissues toward me, as if grief and humiliation belonged to the same aisle. Outside, car tires hissed on wet pavement, and I wondered how a life could be itemized so neatly and handed off with a fountain pen. Don't worry, I'll tell you how a wife of 44 years ends up with a cabin and a promise, while her daughter walks out with the life we built. I'll tell you about the hospital beeps and the night the rain beat the windows like pleading fingers, about the just-in-case visit to Kaplan's office when I stayed home to make soup. I'll tell you about the trust Robert set up for Emily's stability, and the signature he added after the second stroke when the world turned into pill bottles and soft foods. I'll tell you about the voicemail I saved, the one where he said, "We'll talk tomorrow," and how tomorrow arrived in a black suit and a manila folder. And I'll tell you what the cabin hides that nobody counted on when they thought they'd counted everything. If you've ever believed that love and loyalty should mean more than loopholes and fine print, subscribe and stay with me. Because the truth about this inheritance didn't end in that office. It started there. I left Mr. Kaplan's office with the keys singing a half-hearted clink in my purse, as if even they weren't sure they belonged to me. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist that lay over the sidewalks like steam from a kettle, and the city smelled of wet leaves and coffee. Emily walked beside me in her careful heels, her umbrella tilted toward her hair more than my shoulder. Her diamond flashed again and made me think of a lighthouse, something that insists on being seen. She kept her eyes on the pavement, careful steps, careful words. "It's a lot to take in, Mom," she said softly. "Dad wanted stability. You know how he was. Stability. The way people say that word when what they mean is control." I nodded because my mouth still tasted like the pennies you find at the bottom of a purse. I thought of the magnolia in the yard on Maple Street, the blooms that dropped their petals like porcelain in May, and the years before everything turned into paperwork and pill bottles. I thought of the first time I'd brushed white paint across those shutters, and Robert had stood on the lawn with his hands on his hips, telling me I'd missed a spot, and then kissing my wrist when I laughed. 44 years makes a person imagine that memory can protect you. It can't. Emily fumbled with her phone and then tucked it away. "Let's get you home," she said. And I heard the new shape of that word, how the house on Maple no longer wore my name. She meant the place I had just lost, and yet it was the only place she could take me. We drove back along the river into town, past the sandwich shop where Robert and I used to share a bowl of chowder on Fridays when he'd leave work early and tell me I still had that freshman smile, and past the church with the sagging banner that still read, "Welcome back," even though the pandemic had been declared over months ago. I watched the windshield wipers lift and fall like metronomes keeping time for a song I hated. At the house, Emily stood in the doorway for a moment as if she were the guest. Her eyes drifted to the framed photographs on the wall. The family vacation in Bar Harbor when Emily was 10 and couldn't stop asking questions about the tide, the prom picture where she wore navy because I'd said red might be too much and she'd rolled her eyes but listened anyway. Robert and me on our 40th anniversary with a cake so tall we'd frozen half. A flicker passed over her face, tender and hard at once. And then it was gone. "Do you want me to make you some tea?" she asked, and I almost said yes. The room still held the last of Robert's cologne, that warm cedar and citrus that had softened to something like memory's second cousin. I set my purse on the hall table and pulled out the keys. 3 of them: the cabin door, the padlock on the old shed, and a tiny brass key on a circle of red thread, the kind you'd expect on a diary. The brass was dull and gummy, as if it had been handled with sticky hands long ago. I didn't recognize it. My name was on the envelope, Margaret, written in Mr. Kaplan's clerk's neat looping script. The brass key wasn't listed on any paper he'd pushed at us. "Tea would be nice," I said, and I watched my daughter take a mug out of the cabinet I had lined with shelf paper in 1998 while she stayed home with strep throat and asked me to make the shelf liner smell like lavender. She opened the canister of loose Earl Grey that Robert had pretended to hate and then drank every afternoon at 3 because he liked the ritual. "I can stay for a bit," Emily added. "Tyler has a late meeting, but I should be there by 6. Tyler. The way she said his name like a paperweight, as if it kept everything from blowing away. He had been the one to suggest a trust, to my understanding. "Just better planning," he'd told Robert with a smile the Christmas before last, standing by our tree with a glass of red wine that he touched to his lips without drinking. For Emily's stability. For the family. Robert had nodded, and I had held my tongue because the turkey needed basting and because love teaches you when to keep peace. I watched Emily rinse the mug and set it down. Her hands were small and quick, like when she was a child, threading beads. She turned to face me, and the concerned daughter entered the room like an actress hitting her mark. "Mom, I know this feels... I wish there were a way to make it easier. Dad really was thinking of you, just in a different way. The cabin is peaceful. You can write letters up there. You always say you wish you had more quiet. We can talk about selling it, of course, and then you'd have..." "An allowance," I finished in my mind, the word like a shoelace one pulls, hoping the knot gives. "I remember when your father bought that cabin, he was 26, I said instead. He wanted a place to think." "It's so him," she agreed quickly. "You know how he loved that lake. Look at it this way, you won't have to worry about the upkeep of this place. It's a lot for one person. The taxes, the roof, the snow removal. Let me take that on. It's better." It felt like a meeting to decide the fate of someone who had not been invited. "It's maple season," I said, because it was. "The tree out front is going to push those little tassels in a week, sticky and green. Remember what a mess they make." She smiled then, earnest and somewhere else. "We can get a landscaper. Don't worry about any of it. I'll talk to Kaplan about utilities. I'll make sure everything transitions to me smoothly, and we can set you up with autopay for whatever you need. You shouldn't have to fuss with things like that." I had always paid the bills. Every month for 4 decades, I had sat at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes, a pen, and a cup of tea, writing each check in my looping hand, tucking the corners of the stamps. When the world changed, I learned passwords and security questions, saved codes in a little black book I kept hidden inside an old cookbook with a picture of a smiling woman icing a cake. The idea that I couldn't manage my own life, that my hands had somehow turned into child hands when I wasn't looking, made something rise in my throat that I swallowed. "I'll be fine," I said. "But thank you." She hovered in the doorway after that, making suggestions that sounded like offers and offers that sounded like instructions. We would call movers together. We would label boxes together. We would decide what to donate and what to keep. We would keep the piano, for now. She did not quite look at the piano when she said that, and I thought of afternoons when I taught neighborhood children Clair de Lune slowly, my fingers hovering above theirs so they wouldn't be afraid of the soft parts. I'd wanted to teach full-time once, had even started classes at the community college. When Emily arrived, I put the textbooks in the hall closet and told myself it was a pause. The pause turned into a life, and I did not regret it exactly, but there were mornings, early, when I would press one key very gently to hear the kind of note that could lift a bird out of a tree. After she left, The house seemed to inch away from me like a chair someone has pulled quietly across a floor. I walked from room to room, touching the edges of things. The magnolia outside was all dark buds, tight as secrets. In Robert's study, the shelves held his medical journals and the first set of encyclopedias we bought when Emily was 6 and asked where clouds go at night. He had been so proud of those books, the set with gold letters, and he would run his finger along the spines as if the right knowledge might rub off. It was there he had sat with Kaplan's papers the night of the torrential rain, the storm that had rattled the windows and soaked the dogwood until the leaves shone like coins. Emily had called to say she'd take her father to the appointment just in case, and I had said I would stay home and make soup. He had kissed my forehead as if he were in a hurry and said, "Tomorrow, Maggie, we'll talk tomorrow." He'd left his half-drunk tea on the desk. The tea ring was still there. I stood looking at that ring until the light went and the house was just the sound of the refrigerator motor and my own breath. Tomorrow had not surprised us like a party. It had come in a quiet car with a minister who cleared his throat and told me the mercy of sleep was a gift. I had sat in the room with the heart monitor, my hands flat on my knees, and waited for the machines to stop, the way you wait for a song's last note to fall so the air can be itself again. The rain had stopped and started twice, and by morning it was a steady drizzle, and the world continued as if it didn't know what it had done to me. In the days after, I did the things people do without remembering. I put out plates of food that neighbors delivered because kindness needs something to hold. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and stared at the indentation on the mattress where his body had lived. I cut stems for a vase I never used. I listened to messages on the phone from acquaintances who said words like heartbroken and thoughts and prayers, and I thanked them with a voice that was mine and wasn't. I took a casserole to the church potluck a week later because I didn't know where else to be at 6 o'clock on a Sunday, and I sat in a folding chair and ate Jell-O salad and watched little children run in circles until they were nothing but blurred joy. And then Kaplan called, as the sweet arbor of grief gave way to accounting. The will was a roadmap, he said. It would be better for me, he said. Systems, he said. These men and their belief that you can put a life into a manila folder and feel it click. Emily started arriving after work with a notepad and a pen and lines already drawn. We labeled boxes. We agreed that household goods meant the Kappa's shell lamp in the den, the extra duvet, the guest towels. We put the toys from the attic into a plastic bin for the church nursery, except the stuffed sheep that bleated when you pressed its paw. I tucked that one into my suitcase, like a benediction. We worked our way down hallways as if we were moving through a labyrinth. Sometimes she smiled with the memory of a thing, the seashell wind chime from Cape Cod that made a noise like whispering when the air moved, the crooked pine cone wreath Emily made in 2nd grade with a glue gun and determination. Sometimes her face closed like a door. When we reached the master closet, she touched the sleeve of one of Robert's flannel shirts and drew back her hand as if it had become too warm too quickly. On the 3rd day, Tyler came in with his careful shoes and his careful watch and stood in the foyer like a realtor. "We can get a good price," he said. "Market's still favorable. Timing is everything." I saw Emily's chin tilt toward him and away from me. I have learned over the years that there is a power in being the person who is relied upon to be calm. People talk as if your quiet is consent. They forget that quiet is often the only place where you can hear yourself. I made coffee in the kitchen and set a mug in front of him because my mother raised me in a house where you offered a drink to anyone who crossed your threshold, no matter what they brought with them. "You'll be comfortable up there," he said, turning the mug in his hands. "Maine air's good for you. People go up there to rest. And look, Em and I will help with whatever. We're here. You don't need to worry about the tax stuff, the bank stuff. We've got it." He meant, of course, that they would hold those threads in their hands, tie them into bows they would show me as proofs of love. I nodded. "I've always taken care of my own things," I said. "And your father's. He trusted me with the small things people don't see. There were no holes in his socks, and his raincoat was always in the front closet. It's smaller than what you're thinking, the care. But it holds a life together." Emily's gaze flitted to my hands. We know. We're grateful, Mom. This is just complicated. Let's make one thing easy, please. I remembered a different office years ago at the college when I was 20, and a counselor had offered me a scholarship for the piano program, light dancing across her office window, papers in neat piles. You have a reach, she said, smiling, and her hands went from key to imaginary key in the air. Robert and I sat side by side, and he squeezed my knee under the table because the future felt like a big room with all its doors open. We should wait, he said when we got back to the dorm. You have time. We'll get married first. I'll get through med school. You can do music anytime. I said yes, because I loved him, and because people always say that the things of the head can wait while the things of the body make their claims. I set the acceptance letter on top of the refrigerator with the grocery lists and let it be buried. A month later, we brought home a coffee table from a yard sale and set our feet on it while we watched the evening news. That table is still in the den, its corner slightly rounded from an incident with Emily's tricycle when she was 3. Sometimes I wonder which of our choices is the one we stand on for all the rest. By the end of the week, the house was a maze of boxes labeled with a black marker that smelled like high school. The magnolia's buds had swelled, and a pink stain started to show in the green. I told Emily I needed a few days at the cabin to think, to make lists, to be where Robert had once sat on a wide step and told me he loved the sound of crows the way other people love the sound of traffic. She frowned but didn't protest. Call me when you get there, she said. Send me the location so I can share it with Tyler. It makes me feel better. I will, I said, and I meant I would take my time with any sharing. I got up early before the neighborhood had fully woken, before the kids on their scooters made that clackety sound on the sidewalk. I made oatmeal with raisins and cinnamon, the way Robert liked when the mornings were cool, and I ate it standing at the sink, watching a gray squirrel carry a mouthful of something across the fence like ambition. I fed Mr. Whiskers, the stray cat who had appointed our front porch his dining room, and I swept up the magnolia cones that had fallen in the night. I put a change of clothes, a sweater, and my oldest pair of walking shoes into my suitcase, along with a small jar of plum jam I had made in August, and 3 photographs: our wedding day with the pale blue sky, Emily on her father's shoulders at the 4th of July parade with her hair in 2 braids, and a faded Polaroid of Robert and me at the cabin the first summer, his arm around my waist, my hair a halo of frizz the humidity gave me, even when I begged it not to. The drive north took me 3 hours and an entire small carton of black coffee. I stopped at a gas station where you could still get scratch-off tickets and pickled eggs in jars the color of those old Christmas ornaments everyone is too scared to touch. The man at the counter wore a Red Sox cap and asked if I wanted a receipt, and when I said no, he nodded as if I had made a smart life choice. The closer I got to the lake, the more the air began to smell like pine and something mineral, that coolness that lives near water. The sky opened as if it had been holding its breath all day, and I rolled down the window and let it into my hair. The cabin was at the end of a dirt road that never quite agreed to being one road. The ruts had deepened over the winter, and I steered around them like potholes in the city, careful and slightly amused. The trees stood close, the way trees do when they've not been asked to make room for anyone. Their branches laced together like neighbors holding hands. When I parked and cut the engine, the quiet was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears and a chickadee somewhere saying its sweet name again and again. The porch steps creaked like an old friend who forgives you for being away. I held the envelope with the keys and slid the largest into the lock. It stuck for a moment and then gave, and the door exhaled a smell that made my chest ache. Cedar, damp wool, a hint of mouse, the orange oil I had rubbed into the kitchen table one summer afternoon while Robert cleaned the gutters and we argued about whether to let Emily join the travel soccer team. The light fell across the floor in planks that matched the wood, and dust rose in little fountains where my feet disturbed it. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust. The cabin was exactly as we had left it in October when we'd closed for the season because Robert had started needing help with the steps, and I had worried he'd slip on the moss that grew along the path after the rains. The plaid blanket was still draped across the back of the couch, where we sat to watch the lake do its evening change from blue to silver to black. On the mantel, the small wooden loon that Robert had bought from a man at the flea market sat in its eternal flat glide. In the kitchen, the jar of dried beans on the counter caught the light. I opened the refrigerator out of habit, laughed at myself, and found inside a bottle of maple syrup from Mrs. Klein down the road, its label handwritten, and a note I'd left in October that said, "Remember to take this home," and then apparently forgot. The syrup had turned darker over the winter, and I turned it in my hands like a stone. The bedroom smelled like wool and old books. The quilts my grandmother pieced on a treadle machine lay folded at the foot of the bed, the points almost perfectly matched. The window looked out across the water, and for a long time I just watched the way the light made lines on the surface, moving where the wind did. The wall clock, an old schoolhouse thing that always ran 3 minutes slow no matter how I set it, ticked as if each second had weight. I started with the simple things. I opened windows to encourage the stale air to move on. I shook out the rugs and rolled the vacuum across the floorboards, even though the vacuum had never once believed it could truly clean wood. I put a pot of water on to boil and made tea and stood in the doorway with my mug, letting the steam fog my glasses, and thought of the last time Robert had stood in that spot, his hand pressed into the small of his back. He had said the pain would pass. It hadn't. On a shelf in the main room sat a row of books we'd both read and never returned to anyone. Paperbacks swollen from damp, a field guide to birds with Robert's notes in the margins. He had once made fun of me for writing in a book, called it graffiti, and then taken to annotating everything once he started forgetting where he'd put his glasses. His pen was still in the spine of the field guide, and I slid it out. It was the kind of pen that you buy by the box in January, when you think this will be the year you make lists that change the trajectory of your days. On the last page he'd written, "Saw a parula near the dock 2018, and drawn a little arrow that curved like a smile." It was only after I'd made the bed and folded the blankets and told the old cabin it was safe to remember me that I found the small unevenness in the wall where the bedroom met the hall. I wasn't looking for anything. I was running my hand along the cool plaster the way you touch the shoulder of a friend. My fingers found a sliver of wood that jutted, almost invisible unless you were the kind of person who runs her hands along walls. When I pressed lightly, the sliver shifted with the sound of a soft sigh. A square of paneling about the size of a cookbook loosened, and I pulled it forward with both hands. Behind it sat a shelf I didn't know existed, and on it a tin box with a dull red top, the kind of tin cookies used to come in when my mother would save them for buttons. A circle of red thread held the lid closed. I stood there, feeling the house breathe around me. The tiny brass key on the red thread in my purse sparked in my mind like a match in the dark. I went to the front room and fished it out, the metal warmer than I expected. And when I slid it into the little lock on the tin, it turned with the quietest click. My hands trembled in that way they do when you hear a piece of news approaching your doorstep. Inside the tin, layered carefully as if someone had folded years and put them away, were envelopes. Some were addressed to me in Robert's writing that had always leaned too far forward as if it were trying to meet the next sentence before it arrived. Some were addressed to no one, attached with paper clips to small squares of paper that looked like torn napkins with names and numbers on them. Beneath the letters lay a folded map of some kind, the paper thin and soft with age. When I lifted it, it asked me to be gentle. At the very bottom of the tin, wrapped in a piece of blue cloth, was a small notebook bound in black leather, its cover cracked where people's lives leave the marks they do. I didn't open anything right away. I sat on the floor with the tin in my lap and let the fact of it settle. Not because I was frightened, though maybe I was a little, but because grief has taught me to move like a person walking through high grass. You don't know what you'll scare up if you go hacking. The old clock ticked on. Somewhere a loon called, and then waited for an answer no one gave. The first letter had my name, and the words "open first" underlined twice. Robert's hand had grown unsteady at the end, and the lines wavered, but he had underlined with determination. I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the paper. "Maggie," it began, as he had called me since we were 19, and he said my full name sounded too formal for a girl who tied her hair up with ribbon and danced barefoot in August. If you are reading this, it means I am where you cannot follow yet, though somehow it still seems I can reach your shoulder in the night. I thought I had more time to speak, but my words have always been clumsy in the face of your quiet. So I wrote them down here because I've learned, finally, that not every important thing fits on Mr. Kaplan's forms. I set the letter on my knee and let my breath go. The evening light had shifted, and the lake was that impossible, ordinary blue God puts in the world just to show off. My body remembered so many days without being told. Kissing him under a streetlight after the junior dance, digging in the earth together in the backyard to plant that magnolia, arguing with love like you argue with someone you trust not to leave. My body remembered the night he called Kaplan without telling me, and the way I told myself to be reasonable, because reasonable is the coin women are asked to spend to be considered good. He wrote about the trips to the cabin when Emily was little, and we collected milkweed pods and dried them on the windowsill. He wrote about the night he sat in Kaplan's office and let words like trust and stability settle over him like a blanket, because he was tired and our daughter was saying all the right things. He wrote about the second stroke that had taken his confidence into the next room and shut the door behind it. He wrote, and what he did not do was apologize. Not yet. He did what he had always done. He tried to organize the chaos and put labels on it. I kept reading. The cabin was never just a place to think, he wrote. Do you remember my mother's story about her grandfather and the timber rights? You laughed at me for listening so carefully. I laughed too, because it sounded like the kind of thing men in plaid flannel like to say. But when we bought this land, I went to the county and sat with a clerk for 3 hours and found the old survey tucked behind a file marked miscellaneous. The land is tiny, but it touches something bigger. There's an easement across the north edge. A map is in here. You always told me I had a good nose for what might matter later. I'm asking you to trust me, this once, in the direction you would never think to go. Don't sell the cabin until you've spoken to Irene down the road. Don't talk to Emily about this, not yet. She is not a villain, Maggie. She is our girl, but she was born wanting to hold the pen. I made it too easy for her. I am sorry for that in a way I can barely stand to write. Mr. Kaplan does not know everything. I stopped reading then, not because I wanted to hoard the rest, but because my hands were shaking as if I were cold. I went to the window and let the air cool my face. Irene down the road was 90 if she was a day, a woman who made baked beans in a cast-iron pot and set them on her porch for anyone who had helped her shovel out after a storm. She had worked at the post office for 40 years and knew everything that happened in a town without ever leaving her kitchen chair. I smiled despite myself. Robert had met her the second summer when our pipe burst and he had turned off the water at the wrong valve, and she'd called out, "I can hear your mistake from here," from her porch across the lane. I opened the small notebook. Inside were notes in Robert's hand from before his words had started to fight him. Surnames I recognized from the area: Carver, DeWitt, Lopes, arrows connecting them, dates, little starbursts where something mattered. There were numbers that looked like coordinates and a simple sentence: call the Land Conservancy first, then the state. Do not go directly to any private company. There was a shape drawn in the margin that looked like a lake's outline, and then a little rectangle hugging the north end. He had underlined the word survey 3 times. Beneath it, he had written, "It is yours if you know it." I found the map, unfolded it carefully across the bed, smoothing the creases with a hand that had sewed hems and iced cakes and gotten knots out of shoelaces. The paper was thin as an old shirt. The ink had bled in places where damp had visited it. I leaned in. The survey lines were precise, little squares within squares, a geometry of woods. Our cabin's plot lay like a small postage stamp on the corner of a much larger parcel that reached toward the ridge. At the edge of our small square, a dotted line marked an easement, and a notation next to it read, 1876, right-of-way maintained. The names on the surrounding parcels told a story I couldn't quite translate yet, but I could feel the pull of it, like the tug of the lake when you stand near it and the wind is committed to its own plan. I closed the tin after an hour and hid it back where I'd found it. I kept the brass key on a string around my neck because sometimes that is the only way to be sure you do not forget what you need. I made a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast and ate at the small kitchen table, my hand resting on the place where Roberts had rested in summer nights when we played cards, and he won, not because he cheated, but because he would always choose to let me think I was ahead right before he laid down his hand. I washed the dish and set it in the rack to dry. As night pulled itself across the windows, the cabin creaked in the ways it always had, settling and sighing, a body with bones. I heard the soft slap of water against the rocks. I heard an owl in the trees deepen the world with its question. I made a list on the back of an envelope because that is how I have always calmed storms. Call Irene. Find the county clerk. Ask about the survey. Do not tell Emily. That last item I wrote and then underlined once, twice. It made me feel disloyal, and in the same second it made me feel like myself again. God knows I love my daughter like I love my breath, but I have also learned in these weeks that she is using love as a lever in a way that lifts her higher than she should be. She says mom and ease in the same sentence as if the words have always been cousins. When her father got sick, she was here. She brought soup. She sat with him and read articles about the condition, pronouncing the Latin as if it were a puzzle she could solve with sounds. She also sat in Kaplan's office and nodded at the words stability and trust the way Tyler wanted her to. And she did not come home and say, "Mom, we need to talk." I cannot bring that time back, but I can hold a secret until it is ready to meet the light. I slept badly at first, the way you do in a place that is yours and yet has been still without you. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert's handwriting. His insistence turned into hesitation. Toward dawn, I dreamed that the lake rose and lifted the cabin like a hand under a leaf, floating us both out into the middle of the water where everything is quiet and no one can find you unless you want to be found. I woke with my heart in my throat and the taste of pennies again. And I laughed because bodies keep their own little museums. In the morning, I put on my old sweater, the one with elbows that have learned my shape, and I walked down the dirt lane to Irene's house. Her porch was full of potted geraniums that had survived winter on courage alone. She sat on a chair with a blanket over her knees, a mug steaming in one hand, as if she had been waiting for company. "You're late," she said with a smile, and her New England vowels made a song out of it. "I would have come sooner," I said, "but I needed to find the words." "Ha," she snorted gently. "Find the ears first." She patted the chair beside her, and I sat. "How's your heart, Margaret?" "Confused," I admitted, "and busy, and tired, and hopeful in a way that feels like a sin." She sipped her coffee. "You buried a good man with too many plans," she said. "He used to set that watch of his every night on the bedside table over there." She nodded toward her own little bedroom window. I could hear the tick through the wall in summer if the wind was right. Me and that man, we knew when it was 9 o'clock. I miss that sound. But for all his planning, he had a little trouble telling the truth sometimes. Not lying, she added, raising a hand. Just hiding pieces until he thought folks were ready. Men do that. Girls do too, sometimes. "I found a tin," I said, and her eyebrows went up like a curtain lifting. "About time," she said. "He told me he made one. I told him there's no such thing as a secret in a town this small. He said, 'It's not a secret, Irene. It's a kindness.' Well, let's see if he knew what kindness means." We sat there while I told her about Kaplan and the trust and the house, about Emily and her thoughtfulness that felt like a hand on my elbow steering me somewhere I hadn't agreed to go. I told her about the map, the easement, the names, the notebook with its instructions in Robert's hand. She listened without interrupting, a skill I rarely see anymore. When I finished, she reached for my hand and squeezed it. "Land is a funny thing," she said. "Looks simple when you stand on it and complicated as taxes when you put it on paper. But if that map says what you say, and it does, because I can tell when a person has found something true, then you have something folks around here will be interested in. The Conservancy has been trying to knit together a corridor along that ridge for years. Your little square is a corner piece they thought they'd never get. And the state? I asked. She sniffed. The state does what it does, slow and sure as sap, but they'll care. The trick is, don't let anyone who wears a tie and says ma'am in a way that makes your skin itch get wind of it until you've spoken to the people who love this lake enough to know better than to build a key and call it progress. You get me? I did. Emily, she won't understand at first, I said. She'll think I'm hiding money. Are you? Irene asked, eyes amused. The corners of her mouth tugged up, and for a moment she looked like a girl. I'm keeping a promise to a man who left me with a box of puzzles, I said. And I'm holding a piece of my own life where I can see it. She patted my knee. That's the ticket. You go down to the county office today. Ask for Armand. Tell him Irene sent you. He owes me a favor from 1979, and he knows where the good files are. And keep that girl of yours close, but not so close she can take the pen out of your hand. When I walked back to the cabin, the late morning sun had turned the leaves a green I had missed, even though I had lived under trees my whole adult life. I stood on the porch and looked at the lake and remembered the things I had done without applause. I had soaked the stains out of Robert's shirts and learned to love the language of medicine enough to talk to the nurses without fear. I had sold my mother's pearls to make the first tuition payment when Robert's residency salary didn't stretch. I had baked 3 pies for the church fair the year Emily was in high school and stayed up late sewing her dress for the winter formal because the one in the store made her look like someone else. I had gone to work at the pharmacy when money was tight, standing on my feet until they felt like wood, because rent and groceries and the small luxuries such as a new book when Emily had read everything in the library's young adult section by February. I had been there when Robert's hands started to shake and he could no longer trust himself with an IV. I had learned how to drive at night on back roads so I could take him to appointments where the doctors did not always look at me when they spoke, but it was my notebook that held the list of questions. None of that shows up in a will. None of it is something you can bequeath. And yet it is everything I have built my name on. Margaret Walker, wife, mother, now widow. When Emily said stability, she did not mean mine, but I knew how to make my own. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table. A text from Emily. Are you there yet? Send me your location. Love you, I typed. Safe. We'll call later. Love you too. I put the phone face down and let the lake pull the edges off my worry. Then I found the old index card file I kept by the phone all these years for menus and phone numbers and recipes. On a pink card labeled County underlined twice, I wrote, Armand. Ask about 1876, easement along the north. It was early afternoon when I drove into town. The county building smelled of floor wax and old decisions. The clerk's office had 1 counter and 3 metal chairs. A calendar from 5 years ago hung on the wall with a picture of a moose who had seen better days. A tall man with hair that had given up stood at the counter, squinting at a clipboard. When I asked for Armand, a woman with a pencil in her bun called to the back and said, You've got a friend of Irene's, as if she were announcing the weather. Armand appeared like a maple tree in a human suit. He shook my hand and laid it atop his own on the counter. You one of Irene's ladies? He asked. I nodded. Well then, let's get you set. He led me to a table in a side room where the sunlight made squares on the linoleum, and he brought out a stack of maps that looked as if they had stories to tell. We spread them out like a picnic. He pointed to lines and numbers and names. He used a ruler and moved his finger along the easement I had seen in Robert's map. He made a small, satisfied grunt. Hasn't been used in decades, he said, but it's still there. Some folks forgot. The land up along there changed hands in the 70s, and then again in the 90s. Paper got messy, but the old right-of-way stands if you stand on it. See here? That's you. He tapped the little square that was the cabin. And look here, that's the corridor the Conservancy's been working on. You are the hinge on a door they want to swing open. How much is something like this worth? I asked. And I felt my face warm because it's hard to ask a question that sounds like greed when what you mean is dignity. He smiled kindly. Worth to whom? To the woods? Everything? To the folks who are looking to move their snowmobile trail through here? They haven't called, have they? Good. Don't answer if they do. To you, depends on whether you want money or to sit on your porch and know the view won't sprout houses. He leaned back. The Conservancy will make an offer. It won't be millions. Don't let anyone promise you that, but it'll be fair, and more importantly, it'll give you leverage. The state might match. You can get yourself set for the long haul. You can keep the cabin and give the land its own kind of forever. I thought of Emily's diamond and Tyler's careful watch. I thought of a monthly stipend and me still asking permission. I thought of the cabin in summer and the winter when the lake sounds like a person asleep, moving under blankets. I thought of what Robert had tried to do in that office and how he had failed me even as he believed he was protecting me. I thanked Armand and made copies of what he put in front of me. He charged me 50 cents and tried to refuse even that. Irene will yell at me if I let you get it for free, he said. She believes in people paying their way. At the parking lot, my phone buzzed again. Emily. Hey. Tyler thinks we should get Mr. Kaplan to set you up with a financial manager. He knows a guy. Also, can you FaceTime tonight? We want to go over some details about the utilities and the cleaner I'm hiring. Love you. I stared at the screen. I imagined my life turned into bullet points on Tyler's spreadsheet. It made me tired in a way sleep cannot fix. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I typed back, "Will call at 8. I have some things to share. Love you." As I drove back to the cabin, the sky shifted to that late afternoon blue that makes the trees look like cutouts. I rolled down the window and felt the cool on my knuckles. When I pulled into the lane, Irene was on her porch again, her blanket tucked around her legs. She lifted her hand in a gesture that felt like grace and warning at once. At the cabin, I set the copies on the table and put the original letters back in their tin. I looked at the photo of Robert and me at the cabin the first summer, his smile so big it looked like the face of a boy. I remembered the way he had held our daughter the day she was born and cried like there had been a drought in him that was finally over. I remembered the way his hand had shook when he signed the last Kaplan paper. People are more than their worst decision, and also we are accountable for the harm those decisions do. Love can hold both those truths. The trick is learning how to hold them without breaking. When Emily's face appeared on my phone screen at 8, I braced myself for the tone she used when she believed she was rescuing me. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She was in her kitchen with the good marble and the copper pot that had been my mother's on the stove behind her. Tyler hovered in the background, pretending he wasn't there. "How was the drive?" she asked with smile. "You made it okay?" "I shared your location with Tyler just in case. Don't be upset." "I'm not upset," I said, "because there are some battles I can afford to save for later." "The drive was fine. The cabin looks good." I paused. "Emily, I'm going to handle my own finances. I appreciate your concern. I appreciate Tyler's input. I'll ask for help if I need it, but I would like you to trust that I can walk and carry at the same time." Her mouth tightened the way it did when she was 5 and didn't want to share her crayons. "It's not about control, Mom. It's about what's best. We can make this easy." "I know that word is doing a lot for you," I said gently. "But easy isn't always right." I watched her eyes narrow, watched Tyler tilt his head. "There are things about the cabin and the land I need to look into. Your father left me some notes. I'm not going to rush into any decisions." "What things?" she asked, and the contempt that lives under worry peered out. "Mom, it's a cabin. It needs a roof. It probably needs a new septic. It's not an asset. It's a headache. Promise me you aren't getting sucked into one of your ideas that end up with you baking muffins for the whole county and forgetting to call the plumber." I felt the weight of her words settle like a shawl I did not ask for. "I'm not a child," I said simply. "I am the woman who raised you and kept your lunch money in an envelope on the top shelf so the dog wouldn't eat it. I am the woman who got your father to every appointment for 2 years. I am capable, and I am asking you to be patient." She blinked. I saw her thinking. I saw Tyler lean in and whisper something I couldn't hear. "Fine," she said finally, "but don't sign anything. Promise me." "I won't sign anything without reading it twice," I said. "You taught me that, remember? When you were 8 and we went to the Girl Scouts and you wanted permission to use the glue gun? You handed me the form and made me sit at the table until I signed. Her face softened. I remember, she said. And for a moment there was just my girl, the one who used to put both hands on my cheeks when she wanted me to look at her and see her. We'll talk more soon, I said. Get some sleep. After we hung up, I went to the tin again and took out one more letter. The envelope felt heavier in my hand, as if paper could think. Inside, Robert had written words that made my eyes sting even before I read them. I should have talked to you, he said. I should have trusted you to hold the hard parts with me. I let fear and the idea of being a good provider walk me down a path where I forgot the person I was supposed to be providing for. If I could sit across from you now, I would put my hands in yours and I would say, Maggie, I forgot that you don't need to be saved. You need to be seen. Do what you will with this cabin. Do what you will with that land. Give it to the trees. Sell it and buy a sailboat if that's what makes your heart lift. But don't let anyone tell you who you are with a checkbook. You've spent your life spending your life on other people. Now, spend it the way you want. And please, forgive me if you can. If you cannot, love me anyway. I was a good man who did a foolish thing. I knew the difference too late. I folded the letter and pressed it to my heart. Outside, the lake shifted its shoulders under the moon, and a breeze moved through the trees like someone telling a story in the next room. The cabin, with its creaks and its secrets, had handed me a path. The map on the bed lay like a promise. I could feel the first shape of the conflict ahead, the conversations with Emily that would ask me to hold the line without letting go of love, the men with the careful watches who would lean on counters and say my name in a tone that suggested my hair was too gray for a pen, the way grief would sit on the porch some evenings and ask for a cup of tea while I sorted out the land's future like laundry piles. I turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway a minute longer, listening to the old clock do its faithful work. The house on Maple Street had been given to my daughter. The money had gone into accounts with passwords and quarterly statements. I had a cabin that complained when I opened its windows, and a tin with letters that pulled a curtain back on the kind of inheritance they didn't count because they didn't know where to look. I had a name that still fit. I had a key around my neck that felt like a small sun against my skin. And in the morning, I would drive back into town and put my name on a list that meant my voice would be heard. People think the future comes like a train with a schedule. It doesn't. It arrives like a letter slipped between books, waiting for the day your fingers find it. I had spent a lifetime being the person who remembered where the flashlight was when the power went out. Now it was my turn to see in the dark. I woke to a pale ribbon of light on the water and the old clock insisting on its version of time. The brass key on its red thread lay cool against my throat. I touched it the way some women touch a locket, and for the first time in weeks, the ache behind my ribs shifted into something steadier. I boiled water, made oatmeal with a pinch of salt the way my grandmother taught me, and ate it on the porch step with my sweater tugged close. A pair of mergansers cut the lake with clean arrows. The world had resumed, which meant I had a list. I drove back into town for coffee at the little shop where the man at the counter knows everyone's order by the second visit. He asked after Robert with the gentleness people save for hard news they've had time to practice. And when I told him, his eyes softened in that way that isn't pity so much as recognition. He slid a muffin across the counter and said, "On me." "Blueberry, they're from down the peninsula." And I said, "Thank you," because accepting small kindnesses is its own kind of skill. The land trust was a white house, with a squeaky door and a bell that tinkled with more optimism than its budget probably deserved. The woman at the front desk wore a sweater the color of moss and introduced herself as Claire. She took me to a room with a long table and maps on the walls the size of quilts. When I told her Irene had sent me, her entire posture changed, like I had used the correct password at a speakeasy. "We've been trying to piece together that corridor for years," she said, running a finger along a line of green squares. "It's like one of those old jigsaw puzzles with the missing corner. Then you wait 3 years and suddenly your aunt brings over a shoebox, and there it is at the bottom." I'm the shoebox, I said, and we both smiled. I showed her the copy Armand had made for me, the notation from 1876, the dotted line like breadcrumbs. I did not show her the letters. Those were mine for now, as much a promise as the key against my skin. She leaned in over the map and made a humming sound that meant she was doing math and memory at the same time. What does this mean for me? I asked. In plain English. It means you own a piece of leverage, she said. We can offer you a conservation easement for that right-of-way and a small adjacent strip, enough to stitch this together properly. You keep the cabin and the immediate parcel. We protect the corridor. The state might partner. The payout won't make any headlines, but it could make a difference. A solid nest egg, enough to breathe. It also means your view stays a view. She looked up. Do you want to talk numbers now, or do you want to take a breath and come back tomorrow? I want to take a breath, I said, honest. And I want to be on your next meeting agenda. If I do this, I want it done with light on it. No secret papers on a desk. Next Tuesday evening, she said. Town office, 7 sharp. We present, the select board asks questions, public comments, then a vote to endorse state matching if it comes. I'll put your name on the list. It helps when the person who actually lives with the trees speaks. I nodded. I can do that. When I walked out, the sun had moved into that spot where it makes everything look like it's wearing a halo, even the stop sign. I called Irene from the car and told her the plan. Good, she said. Wear that key like you mean it. Back at the cabin, I found myself straightening the table and wiping a spot that wasn't there. People prepare for hard things in the oddest ways. I was smoothing napkins for a meeting 5 days away while life was already tapping its foot. Emily arrived the next day without warning. I heard the tires on the ruts and the quick knock that wasn't really a knock. I opened the door to her, a gust of perfume and purpose. You should have told me you were coming up, she said. I would have driven with you. She peered around my shoulder into the room as if checking for hazards. This place is charming. It is amazing how that word can sound like a compliment and a diagnosis. She put her bag on the table next to the copies I hadn't meant to leave out, and my heart did a small, audible thing. What's this? She asked, already reaching. I put my hand on the papers. Work, I said. Mine. She pulled her hand back, surprised. Her eyebrows made an unfamiliar shape. Mom, we're on the same side. I know, I said. And in the same second, I knew she believed it. She believed that her side was the side a sensible person stands on. Do you want coffee? She wandered through the room, pretending not to look through drawers. At the bookcase, her fingers landed on a photo of her father holding up a string of fish with an expression that said he'd saved the family from starvation, when in reality we had grilled cheese for dinner and fed the fish to the neighbor's cat. She set the frame down more gently than I'd expected. Tyler talked to Kaplan, she said. He thinks it would make sense for you to sign a limited power of attorney for financial matters, just to make things smoother. You wouldn't have to worry about utility transfers or any of the taxes and— No, I said, and the word made a clean sound in the air. She blinked. Mom. No, I repeated. I've thought about it. I'm not signing anything right now. I'm taking care of the cabin and the things that go with it. I'm sorting out the land. I'm meeting with some people next week. What people? Her mouth tightened. Mom, I get that you want to feel independent. I do. But this isn't a fairy tale about a plucky older woman who doesn't need help. This is paperwork and money and predatory companies. There are people who will take advantage of you. And there are people who already did, I said, quietly enough that the words seemed to land on the wooden floor and stay there. I'm not accusing you. I am telling you that your father and I made 44 years of decisions together, and some of the last ones were made in a room with you at the table and me making soup. I have a right to make a few now. You don't have to like it. Her eyes shone then, and she looked at the ceiling the way she does when she is trying not to cry. You think I did this to you on purpose, she said. You think I sat in that office and, what, stole your life? I think you sat in that office scared, I said. I think Tyler said words that sounded like safety. I think your father was tired and wanted to protect you from an unknown future. I think none of you thought about the woman who has kept the lights on for 44 years without anyone watching. I touched the key at my throat. And I think the future doesn't always need a chaperone. She laughed then, a sound with hard edges. That's pretty, Mom. It's also reckless. Then we will disagree, I said. But I need you to hear me. I am not moving on to an allowance you approve while you schedule my life with a spreadsheet. I'm meeting with the land trust. There's a right-of-way that— What? She cut in. A what? Old boundary business, I said, because my instinct was still to fold things in until they were ready to be seen. It's not a conversation for right this second. Come to the meeting on Tuesday. Bring Tyler. Bring Kaplan if you must. Sit in the second row and let me finish a sentence. This is ridiculous, she said, but her voice lacked heat. She looked at my hands like she was seeing them for the first time. Fine. Tuesday. But promise me you won't sign anything before then. I promise I'll read everything twice, I said. And once more after that because my eyes aren't what they used to be. She stayed for an hour and fussed with the blankets and wiped a spot on the counter and set a jar of grocery store flowers on the table that smelled like nothing and color. When she left, the cabin inclined itself back toward me as if to say, "You did it. Not everything, but something." The next days were a steady march. I drove to the county office again and had Armand initial the copy of the survey like it was a library book we were both agreeing to love. I called a lawyer named Lorraine in the next town over, someone Irene trusted, a woman who wore her hair like a crown she didn't have to apologize for. We sat in her office with diplomas on the wall and a candy jar nobody ever really wants, and she explained things without making me smaller. We wrote a letter together to the land trust outlining my intentions to consider the easement after the public meeting and requesting draft terms. We wrote another letter to Mr. Kaplan informing him, politely, that I would be handling my own affairs and that any further discussion about my finances should be directed to me, not my daughter or her husband. You think that'll make him mad? I asked, signing with a pen that wrote a fatter line than my usual. I think it will make him aware, she said. Being aware is not a punishment. When I returned to Maple Street to pick up more things, the front lawn had a sign stuck in it like a claim flag. Coming soon, written like a promise. 2 women in black leggings and crisp shirts were measuring the living room and sticking round dots on the floor where the furniture would look better if the house belonged to someone else. Emily had hired a stager. A man I didn't recognize was wiping a cloth across the piano, testing its surface like a jeweler. My ribs tightened like a fist. "Ma'am," one of the women said, brisk and pleasant, "you must be Margaret. We're just going to make everything look its very best. Can we move this bench to the garage? It's charming, but a little dated." The bench her great-grandfather had carved in 1925. I could still feel the divot worn by decades of mittens. "You may not move it to the garage," I said. "You may leave it where it is until I have time and a truck and 2 hands with a sense of history." The woman blinked. "Of course," she said, a little stiffness sneaking into the curve of her mouth. The man at the piano nodded at me without quite seeing me. I found Emily in the kitchen with her notepad, writing boxes around other people's nouns. "I was going to call you," she said. "We're ahead of schedule. It'll photograph beautifully." "The piano doesn't photograph," I said. "It sings." She rolled her eyes in a way I hadn't seen since she was 16, and all I had to do to exist was to be an affront. "Don't get sentimental," she said. "It doesn't help." "It helps me," I said, "and this is mine to feel." Then I saw it. An orange sticky note on the piano's fallboard, the letters in someone else's hand. "Sell?" The question mark was an insult, not a courtesy. Behind my breastbone, a stone moved. "No," I said, and I pulled the note off and folded it in half until the glue stuck to itself. "This goes with me. I don't care if we have to hire a crane or call 4 high school hockey players with big hearts and bigger deltoids. It goes. It is not hers to keep or yours to sell. Mom, the cabin won't—" She stopped, realizing how that sentence would end. "The cabin won't what, Emily?" I asked softly. "Won't accommodate a life? Watch me." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "You're being difficult. I'm being clear, I said. There's a difference. I carried the tin from the cabin back to the house that afternoon. It rode on the seat beside me under a towel as if I were shielding it from light. In our bedroom, I opened it on the bedspread and took out the letter with Robert's apology again, the one where he said my name like an answer. I slid it into an old folder and tucked the key under my shirt next to my skin. I had never been a woman for talismans. Life had taught me to keep my head down and my hands busy, but the key at my throat made me taller. On Tuesday afternoon, the sky gathered itself for rain and then reconsidered. I put on a blouse the color of the lake in late summer and the sweater with the elbows that had molded to me. I tied the key's red thread twice to make sure it wouldn't slip. I stopped at the church thrift store to drop off a bag of things that felt like they had served their time. A sweater of Robert's that smelled like the inside of a memory. A pair of shoes that had hurt my feet for years because I kept hoping they'd learn to be kinder. The woman at the counter squeezed my hand and told me she was praying for me. For wisdom, she said. And I thought that was exactly the right thing. The town office was brighter than usual, the fluorescence doing its earnest best. Folding chairs multiplied down the length of the room like mushrooms after a wet week. An American flag leaned in the corner, the eagle at the top looking bewildered by its indoor job. A table up front held microphones and 3 paper cups of water and a placard for each select person with their names written in a careful hand. People came in with that particular town meeting energy, the chatters, the nodders, the ones who sit with their arms crossed and their eyebrows high, the ones who never speak and always come. Irene was already there in the second row, her blanket over her knees even indoors like a statement of continuity. Claire from the Land Trust set up a projector that squeaked and then worked, as if it had demanded to be coaxed into doing good. Emily came with Tyler and sat on the aisle where she could make an exit or an entrance, whichever seemed necessary. Mr. Kaplan slipped in and took a seat near the back with the air of a man who wants to see and not be seen. He didn't look at me, and I didn't look for him. A man I didn't recognize wore a tie that looked like it had been folded in a drawer for 20 years and a name tag that read Dale. He had the air of a representative of something, county recreational trails perhaps, or a club where old ideas sit on high stools. I tucked that observation into my pocket. The meeting began with the pledge, and I said the words the way I've said them since first grade, with more muscle memory than fervor. The chair of the board, a woman named Ruth with white hair and a voice that carried without strain, did her housekeeping. Minutes approved, invoices acknowledged. Then she said, "We have a presentation from the Land Trust regarding a proposed conservation easement that involves a right-of-way. After the presentation, we'll allow public comment. Please keep remarks to 3 minutes and refrain from personal attacks. We are here to listen." She looked at me when she said the last part, which I took as a benediction. Claire stood, nervous for 2 sentences, and then steady. She spoke about habitat corridors and migration patterns. She used words like mosaic and contiguous that made the woods sound like a quilt your grandmother had planned 100 years ago, and you were finally allowed to wrap around your shoulders. She pointed to the map, where my tiny square touched the big green need. She explained that the right-of-way deed from 1876 allowed for passage across the north edge of my parcel into the larger tract beyond, and that while it had not been maintained in decades, it was still a thread through the cloth. She said the Land Trust proposed to purchase an easement to guarantee protection of the corridor and to work with the state for matching funds. "It matters," she finished simply. "And we don't always get to say that about the paper we shuffle." Ruth nodded. "Thank you, Claire. We'll open the floor to comments." A hand went up in the 3rd row. Dale stood and cleared his throat. "Name's Dale," he said unnecessarily. "I represent the County Trails Coalition. We've been talking to some folks about expanding the snowmobile network. Tourism dollars, you understand. This right-of-way would be right handy for that. I just want to register that interest." He smiled with his lips and not his eyes. "Thank you," Ruth said evenly. "Noted," another hand. "I'm Eugenia," a woman said. "I don't love snowmobiles. I love birds. I vote yes." There was a sprinkling of laughter. Ruth looked at me and lifted her chin a fraction. It was time. I stood. The key warmed under my blouse as if it had agreed to this before I did. My knees were not young and my voice had lived a life, but the room quieted in that way rooms do when the point arrives and everyone recognizes it. "My name is Margaret Walker," I said. "I've been on Maple Street for 36 years, and at the cabin by the lake for 40, off and on, more on when the world felt loud. My husband died in March. He was a good man who did some foolish things, as good men sometimes do. He wrote me letters before he went, and one of them told me to pay attention to a little strip of land that touches a larger dream. So here I am, paying attention." I could feel Emily's stare, sharp as a pin. I kept my eyes on Ruth. That was my line I had drawn. I would tell the truth without using it as a weapon. "I'm not here to talk about family business that belongs at a kitchen table," I said. "I'm here to say that the right-of-way from 1876 is still there, and that it matters that we keep this place a place where spring still has frogs and winter still has quiet. The land trust has offered an easement that would help me keep a roof over my head without selling my soul. I want this room to know I intend to accept that offer after we have the right conversations and the right protections written down. I don't want a snowmobile trail through my living room. I don't want a developer to cut a line arrow straight through the part of the world where loons teach their babies to swim. I want to sit on my porch and know that when I am gone, some small kindness remains that no one else knew to count." Dale shifted, ready to speak. Ruth lifted a hand without looking at him, a quiet that functioned like a held door. "Go on," she said to me. "My daughter is in this room," I said, and I heard a breath move across the chairs like a wind. "She is a good woman with a spreadsheet heart. She is learning that love without listening is just an instruction. I am learning that quiet without a voice is just a rumor. So I am here to say out loud that I am not selling my cabin to fix a problem created in a room where I wasn't invited. I am keeping it, and I am giving the trees what they asked me for when I was a girl and didn't know I was being asked. I am asking this board to endorse the Land Trust's application for state matching funds so that a widow with a key around her neck doesn't have to stand here again next month to argue with a man who thinks snowmobiles count as a plan." There was laughter again, softer this time, and then a murmur like rain starting on a tin roof. I felt my face heat. I was not a woman who made speeches, but grief had stripped something off me that caution used to live behind. No one clapped because this wasn't that kind of meeting, and I was grateful for the respect of silence. Ruth nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker," she said, her formality like a hand placed respectfully at my back. "Any other comments?" Of course there were. A man who lived near the ridge talked about his property taxes. Someone worried about what easements meant when his grandchildren wanted to build a garage. Eugenia said the word warbler with such fierce affection that I wanted to invite her home for tea. Dale stood again and talked about families coming up from Massachusetts with their wallets and their snow gear, and how towns like ours needed to think about commerce. He said the word ma'am 3 times, but he did not say it to my face. Tyler was the one I didn't expect. He raised his hand, stood, and introduced himself like a man who had already measured the room. "I just want to say," he began, "that managing assets is complicated. People make sentimental decisions that have consequences. Perhaps we should consider—" "What we should consider," Ruth said, a little steel in her voice now, "is the matter before us. This is not a family court or a planning commission. Mrs. Walker has made her position plain. The Land Trust has made their proposal. The question is whether this board will endorse the application for state matching funds. Anything else is gossip dressed up as policy." Something in my chest that had been braced for weeks let go. Emily sat rigid beside Tyler, her eyes bright. She wasn't angry, I realized with a shock. She was startled. "It is a strange thing to discover your mother is a person," the board discussed. The words moved around the table like chess pieces. In the back, Mr. Kaplan looked at his hands, and then at me, then away. When they called for a vote, Ruth said, "All in favor?" And hands rose, one after another, like aspen leaves catching light. "Opposed?" Dale's hand lifted and then fell, a little lost. The motion carried. The room let out the breath it had been holding. Outside, People filtered onto the steps with that pleasant buzz that follows civic acts. Someone pressed my hand. Eugenia hugged me quickly and said, "Black-throated blue, if you're lucky." And I nodded as if we had discussed a child's birthday present. Claire put a folder in my hand with draft easement language and a timeline. "We can make this go fast or slow," she said. "It's your pace." "Fast enough that I don't have to field a dozen winter calls from Dale's friends," I said, and she laughed. Emily found me on the grass at the edge of the parking lot near the lilac bush that had never bloomed as spectacularly as it promised. She stood with her hands at her sides, shoulders squared. The diamond at her finger caught the last of the light and threw it into the grass where no one needed it. "You made a speech," she said in a voice that had no edges now. "I did," I said. "I needed to hear myself, and I think you needed to hear me." She looked down. She stopped. When she spoke again, the words came from farther inside. "When Dad called Kaplan, I felt like you were both making decisions without me. I thought the trust kept me safe from being left to clean up a mess. I told myself I was protecting you." Her laugh was small and unkind, but only toward herself. "You don't need me to protect you." "I need you to stand with me," I said, "and sometimes to stand down. Those are different skills." She nodded. "I can try." She glanced at the key around my neck. "What is that?" "Something your father left for me," I said. "It opens things I didn't know were closed." She looked like she might ask more, then thought better. "Some doors you respect by letting them be closed until someone invites you through." Tyler came over, all careful angles. "That was an interesting meeting," he said. "It was a meeting," I replied, "and now I'm going home to make scrambled eggs and toast. You're both welcome if you can tolerate eggs at 8:30. Emily laughed for real. "We can tolerate anything if there's toast." She slipped her arm through mine, tentative. We walked to the car, the three of us, and I felt the strange stretch of a family that had been pulled in two directions and was seeing if the middle could hold. Over eggs, we didn't talk about money. We talked about the time Emily fell off the dock and laughed while she choked because she was 10 and there was more spring than good sense in her. We talked about the magnolia and whether this would be one of those years when it throws all its petals in a day like confetti. Emily washed the plates as if she had always lived in a place where the sink and the light and the window knew her height. Tyler dried them carefully and set them in the rack. He looked around the cabin and I watched something soften in him. Not admiration or pity, awareness. After they left, I took out the tin and sat with Robert's letters at the small table. I wrote a note of my own on a piece of plain paper with a grocery store pen. "Robert, we are making something out of the mess. It isn't perfect. It is honest. I wish you were here for the part where the room got quiet and I stood without shaking. It turns out I know how to do that. Thank you for the map, even if the route hurt me on the way. You always did like a good paradox." I folded the note and slid it under the rubber band that held the loose envelopes together. I put the tin back in its small secret. I touched the key and felt the thump of my heart beneath it. Steady now. The days after the meeting moved with purpose. Lorraine and I sat with Claire and a man from the state whose suit understood how to bend at the elbow. We wrote language that protected the land and protected me. We negotiated an amount that made me feel both surprised and reasonable. We made a schedule. We talked about survey pins and signage and what to do if someone decided they didn't like new rules. We decided that all of it would be discussed in the open at one more meeting with a vote and a handshake and a photograph none of us would ever get around to framing. I said yes to a check that would give me light in the months that would follow. There were still injustices like small stones in a shoe. A man at the bank called me dear 3 times and explained compound interest as if he'd invented it in his garage. A cousin I hadn't heard from in 5 years sent a message that said, "If you need help deciding what to do with all that property," with a winky face that made my skin want to go live someplace else. Emily texted me a link to an article about elder fraud with a note that said, "Just be careful." And I had to put the phone down and breathe because care had become a word so wide it could cover control with room to spare. And then there were the small salvations. A girl at the hardware store carried a bundle of kindling to my car and asked if the cabin was the one with the red door where the cat sleeps on the step. She told me that when she was little, her grandmother pointed to our place and said, "That's the house that listens to the lake." Irene left a pie on my porch with a note that said simply, "There are worse ways to win a thing than with your voice." The morning after a rainbow lay so low over the lake I could have walked under it if I'd been quick. On a bright Friday, I sat at the Maple Street piano while two broad-shouldered boys from down the block maneuvered it onto a dolly. I played the first bars of Autumn Leaves with a left hand that remembered everything and a right hand that forgave the rest. Emily stood in the doorway and watched the boys strap the piano and lift and lean. "You're sure?" she asked, and I nodded. She opened the door wider, and the three of us and the music we were carrying moved out into a future we had decided together could still hold a few old songs. When the easement closed, it was in a room with a window that framed a maple leaf as if it knew its role in the occasion. I signed, Lorraine signed, Claire signed, the man from the state signed. Armand stopped by with a paper bag of donuts and stood in the doorway like a man who knows when to say nothing and when to say congratulations. We shook hands all around, and everything felt official and human at once. The check was not a miracle. It was enough. Enough to pay for a new roof at the cabin and a septic that wouldn't keep me up at night listening for the sound of failure. Enough to make a bank manager look at me as if I were a person who made decisions rather than a person decisions happened to. Enough to teach me that I had been waiting to speak on my own behalf without knowing it. Emily and I went back to the house after and stood under the magnolia watching a breeze lift the first fallen petals. "Do you forgive me?" she asked without looking at me. I thought about that word. It is a big door with many rooms behind it. "I love you," I said. "That one I can promise without thinking. The rest is a practice. We'll do it like scales, a little every day." She nodded and took my hand. "And you forgive Dad?" she asked. I looked up into the branches we had planted with our hope hands. "I do," I said, and felt the truth of it settle like a bird. The cabin breathed out when I returned that night, the way houses do when they recognize your footsteps. The key was warm where it sat. I made tea and sat on the porch in the deepening dusk with the loon's flat song somewhere offshore and the warbler Eugenia had promised visiting the black spruce. I thought of the office where the lemon polish had made dignity smell like furniture. I thought of Mr. Kaplan's averted eyes and Tyler's careful watch and Emily's diamond. I thought about how easily a woman can be turned into paperwork if she isn't careful. And then I thought about a room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs and a white-haired woman named Ruth who had believed me when I stood. I thought about Arthur's marked maps and Irene's practical blanket and Armand's laugh and Claire's quiet grit. Humiliation had piled up like snow at the end of a driveway when the plow goes by and leaves you a mountain to dig through. I had stood there with my little shovel thinking it would take forever. It didn't. It took a sore back and a neighbor who stopped with a bigger shovel and a town meeting where people remembered what the word neighbor means. It took a letter from a man who loved me and failed me and loved me enough to admit it. It took a small brass key on a piece of red thread and the decision to wear it where the world could see. When the first real cold came in October, I put the quilts on the bed and stacked the wood in the little nook by the stove and brought the geraniums inside because even brave things need shelter. Emily came up with a pot of beef stew and a loaf of bread from the bakery where they still give you the end piece if you ask nice. We ate at the small table with the map still rolled on its end against the wall like a guardian. "Do you ever think about the other life?" she asked, not meeting my eyes, as if the truth needed the air to get ready. "Every day," I said, "but not in the way you think. I used to believe the other life was the one I didn't let myself have. The piano program, the late nights at the bar on the corner where the jazz players taught me how to ask a question with my hands, the apartment with the drafty windows and the wool socks. But lately, I think the other life is the one where I never found the tin, where I never went to the meeting, where I said yes to a different kind of quiet and let it cover me like snow." I shrugged. "I like this one better." She smiled, sad and proud. Me too, she said. Winter arrived in its orderly fashion, the lake iced over at the edges, then across, then back at the edges again, where the sun found it. I learned the new sounds: a fox in the woods, the crack of ice like the world stretching. The Conservancy put up small signs on the trees along the easement with little leaves stamped in green. I walked the line one afternoon with a thermos of hot chocolate and my mittens and the knowledge that I had made a mark no one could repossess. The Colonial on Maple Street sold in November to a couple with a baby that made the house look young again. They took down the sagging "Welcome Back" banner at the church and put up a new one that said simply, "Welcome," and left it at that. Emily and Tyler moved into their place off Elm, and she sent me a picture of the magnolia in the yard with the caption, "First spring here," and I wrote back, "Wait for the mess and the beauty." The piano sat against the wall in the cabin under the window where the light fell at 4 o'clock, and the first time I taught a girl from down the lane to find middle C, I felt the future turn and look at me as if I had finally learned its name. On the kind of afternoon when the sun is the color of honey and the leaves have done their best and are nearly done, I sat on the porch with the tin on my lap. I took out the last letter I hadn't dared to open. It was thin and light, his hand steadier than the others. "Maggie," it said, "if you are the sort of woman I know you to be, you are reading this at a table or a door or a place where the light makes sense. If there is a key around your neck, I hope it is warm. If there is a lake in front of you, I hope it is listening. Thank you for staying when you didn't have to. Thank you for leaving when you needed to. I wish we had been brave at the same time more often. I wish for you long mornings and the kind of quiet that is full and not empty. Love, always, Robert." I folded the letter. The lake lay before me, blue and ordinary, miraculous. I thought of everything I had been handed that felt like a sentence, and how, with a piece of thread and a square of old paper, it had turned into a paragraph I could write myself. I thought of the clock in the other room, still 3 minutes slow no matter how I said it, and I laughed out loud. Time wasn't wrong. It was finally mine. When the loons called, I answered, not in their language, but with the simple human sound of someone who can hear and be heard. When the loons called, I answered, not in their language, but with a small human sound that felt like a promise. The sound left my throat and settled over the lake like a paper boat. It was a hello and a thank you and a letting go all at once. The cabin listened, as it always had, and the key warmed against my skin as if it approved. There were immediate things to attend to. The Conservancy wanted an initial survey marker put in place before the winter freeze. Contractors needed to be scheduled for a new roof, and Lorraine wanted a final look at the easement language. The check sat in the bank like a quiet ally, its edges sharp but somehow manageable. Mr. Kaplan sent a letter with his condolences, all neat and legal, and I answered with one line that said simply, "Please direct any further discussions about my finances to me." He did not reply. A silence like a closed door followed like a sensible neighbor. The first consequence of the town meeting's decision arrived in the form of a workman's truck and 2 men from a roofing company who smelled of diesel and peanut butter. They were young enough to curse with a kind of bravado, men half their age, no longer reserved for bar stools, and polite enough to worry aloud about the weight of snow. We measured shingles against the horizon. They gave me a price that left room for dignity. When they asked me if I wanted to talk to my daughter about the timing, I found myself answering with a steadier voice than I expected. "No, thank you, I'm handling it." The words felt like a small, well-made tool. Emily used to call when she thought of me in the middle of the day, breathless with a detail or proud of something she'd arranged. After the meeting, she called differently. Careful at first, then gradually with a curiosity that did not thin into condescension. There was a night, 2 weeks after the vote, when she showed up at the cabin with a pot of stew and a loaf of bread, the smell of the bakery still clinging to her sleeves. Tyler walked in behind her carrying a thermos and an apologetic smile. They stayed the afternoon. We talked about practical things, when the boys would move the piano, who would pick up the shingles at the yard, whether the Conservancy would allow a small sign at the edge of the path that said in modest letters, "Protected." but we talked more about things that do not show up on forms. Emily wanted to know which of Robert's shirts I wanted to keep, and I asked her to play me a recording from years ago when he had sung off-key in the kitchen because he thought he could make coffee sound like dialogue. She laughed, and then cried, and then laughed again, and the sound knitted between us like a new seam. We did not fix everything overnight. There were afternoons of stubborn silences and mornings of cautious rapprochement. There were moments when Emily would walk back into the room with a question that carried the old impatience, and I would answer with a story about when she refused to wear a raincoat and learned to dance in a puddle instead. She would look at me then, the way children look at elders who have just performed a small magic trick. She would see me as someone who had held 1,000 tomorrows in her hands and still managed to be present now. Tyler learned to make oatmeal that tasted like a mild apology, and I learned to appreciate a man who could manage his calendar without needing to manage my teeth. He apologized more than he needed to and listened more than he had before. Watching them in the kitchen, his careful hands setting a mug down, her face unguarded when no one else watched, it felt like seeing two people find the language of compromise. It gave me hope that the world of my daughter's making might hold room for others as well as plans. The Conservancy's sign went up in a small ceremony that smelled of coffee and damp leaves. Armand came with a dozen donuts in a paper bag, like a herald in sensible shoes, and Irene wore a hat with a feather she found at a church rummage sale because she believed celebrations ought to be a little theatrical. Claire spoke about corridors and habitat and the way trees understand each other. Eugenia, who had a binocular strap forever embroidered with tiny, hopeful birds, showed up and insisted on standing next to me for a photograph. There were cameras, phones mostly, and people who clapped with the cautious enthusiasm of a crowd at a high school graduation. The Conservancy gave me a metal tag to attach to the property records and a map with little green loops signifying the easement. It felt official and not sterile. It felt like protection offered with the tenderness of a neighbor who brings a casserole after a funeral. The money was not extravagant, but it was honest. Enough to pay for a new roof that would keep the rain from learning new songs. Enough for a septic repair that would mean I slept without the low hum of worry. Enough to buy a small insurance policy and hire a young woman from town, Hannah, to come twice a week and help me manage the heavier tasks. It meant I could say yes to a little freedom without the weight of guilt. It meant I could pay for a piano mover and not worry about negotiating the cost in the messenger tone of a child asking for a cookie. When the bank manager stopped calling me dear, it was not because he discovered my charm. It was because he saw a woman who signed her name with intention. There was fallout. A cousin sent a text that looked like a joke and read like an offer. A man from a land development group left a voicemail that I refused to listen to more than once. These were the small stones that chip at the edges of peace if you let them. But each time I felt the impulse to retreat, I took the key from its red thread and pressed it into my palm until the metal warmed and the worry felt less like a storm and more like weather. The key stopped being merely a physical object. It became a decision. It unlocked the tin where the letters lived, yes, but more importantly, it unlocked a permission I had long denied myself, the permission to insist on being seen without apology. Winter taught me a different rhythm. The lake iced and thawed and iced again, and I learned when to leave an extra log by the stove and when to call a neighbor to check on the driveway. The quilt at the foot of the bed smelled like cedar and dust and passing seasons. I taught lessons to a girl named Josie, who biked from down the lane and had a laugh like a bell. Her mother worked nights at the diner and trusted me with an hour of her child's curiosity. There is a particular joy in teaching someone to find middle C and watching their face when they understand that a note is like a small, steady sunrise. In those moments, I felt the sum of my life make sense, not as a ledger, but as a melody. Months later, the Colonial on Maple Street sold. The new owners were young and full of the kind of hope that hums in the paint fumes of a new coat. They knocked on my door with a loaf of bread and a simple card that said, "Thank you for caring for the house." The magnolia bloomed that spring with dramatic generosity, petals falling in a slow confetti. Emily and Tyler sent a photo of their kitchen with a newborn grin in a carrier, the caption, "First spring here," and my heart, which had been home to many things, rearranged itself to make room for this new smallness. Forgiveness, the kind that finally stitches the heart, did not arrive as a thunderclap. It came in increments. It was in Emily's hand finding mine in a grocery store aisle and not letting go until we reached the register. It was in the way she started calling me before she made appointments for the house, just to ask, "Did you want to come?" A respectful form of consultation rather than an announcement. It was in the way Tyler started to listen to my stories about Robert, not as prefaces to practical tips, but as material to know a man who had been part of the architecture of my life. I forgave Robert because the letters had made room for his whole self, his charms and his mistakes. And because forgiveness is not the erasure of hurt, but the choice to let it teach you rather than define you. One afternoon that June, I walked the easement line with Claire and a man from the state. The air smelled of cut grass and wet earth, and a pair of warblers flitted in the black spruce like curious commas. Claire stopped beside a small stake with a green ribbon and said simply, "This is the part that matters most to me." She looked at me as if I had been her colleague for years. There is a funny power in turning 80 acres of abstract policy into a place where a chickadee can find food. We talked in practical terms. Who would maintain the signage, how to handle any future disputes. And then, because human beings need small ceremonies, Claire took a ribbon from her pocket and tied it to a branch. "For luck," she said, "for good neighbors." We both laughed, because people who work for the land trust have a practical superstition all their own. At night, I would sit with the tin in my lap and place my small note against Robert's letters. I kept them there, not because I wanted to be stuck in the past, but because they were the map that had led me out of the fog. The brass key rested in its small bowl near the door, its red thread frayed like the edge of a story told loud. It had done more than unlock a secret shelf. It had become a way to name the life I wanted to keep. It reminded me that the things you inherit are not always money or property, but sometimes the absolute right to decide what matters. There were small triumphs and domestic joys, a roof that no longer whispered with every heavy cloud, a septic system that hummed like a satisfied appliance, a piano that took up a new corner of the living room and taught a new set of fingers how to respect silence and sound. I learned to say no without turning it into a drama. I learned to ask for help without fearing that it would always be offered with a bill attached. I learned, too, to accept the kindness of strangers, of Hannah who shoveled the walk on bitter mornings, and of a woman in town who left a packet of wool socks on my porch for the winter, with a note that said simply, "For warmth." Sometimes, on good days, Emily and I would stand on the porch and listen to loons. We did not always talk. Sometimes we stitched a silence with the thread of shared memory. A backyard cookout where Robert burned the hot dogs on purpose because he liked the smell. A prom dress that had been hemmed under thread of tears. A lullaby hummed in a hospital room that was mostly machine and love. Over time, there were fewer resentments and more complicated human understandings. She learned that asking to take the pen is different from insisting that only your ink be allowed to mark the paper. I learned that stepping back did not mean stepping away. The brass key became a metaphor in the way only small objects do. They begin as tools and become language. I wore it to town meetings when they mattered, to the bank when politeness turned into patronizing language, to bed some nights when my hands needed an anchor. It sat against my skin like a sun, warming that place just above the sternum where memories sit. It was a pendant, yes, but also a promise I had given myself, to open the doors I chose and to leave closed those I did not. There is a particular peace in being the author of your small life. It is not a headline. It does not make anyone wealthy in the way $6 million can, but it teaches you how to be brave under the radar. It teaches you how to stand in a room of folding chairs and make a speech so ordinary and honest that the town remembers to be neighborly again. It teaches you how to love someone who has hurt you while holding firm to what you need to live. It lets you sleep at night without the taste of copper at the back of your tongue. On a late afternoon in October, when the light turned the birch trunks into a columned room, I sat with Josie at the piano and watched her small hands find the chord progression of a simple song. She smiled at me like she had discovered a secret. I thought about all the melodies I had taught, and all the ones I had kept to myself. I thought about Robert and the letters, about Irene's blanket and Armand's laugh, about Claire's maps and Ruth's steady procedural kindness. I thought about how, in the end, a life is a series of small decisions that add up to a shape. I lifted my hand and, without dramatics, placed the brass key on the piano while Josie reached for the next note. The metal caught the light and threw a small, warm gleam across the keys. It was absurdly beautiful, both a simple thing and a compass. I closed my eyes and felt, for a long, slow heartbeat, that I had been given a kind of freedom I had never planned for. Not the freedom to spend without regard, but the freedom to choose what to protect and how to show up. If any of this touched you, if the idea of quiet courage or second chances rang like a note you recognize, you can tell me in the comments. Tell me about a key you keep or a letter stacked in a tin. If you liked listening, press like to let me know you were here for the whole song. And if you want to hear more stories about ordinary bravery and complicated love, subscribe so we can keep sharing them together. The loons called again as the sun slid down. I answered, and this time my voice was steady. The key lay warm on the piano, its red thread a pulse. I had a house that hummed with new life, a cabin that would keep its quiet, a daughter who was learning kindness the long way, and a map that said the future need not be written by anyone but me. In the way the loons know the lake, I knew my place. Small, anchored, and wide enough for the birds to teach me the language of home.